What if you lived in a horrible dystopia, but you didn't even realize it? We're not talking theory or fiction here. We're talking real life right now. Many thinkers have argued that modern life is slowly killing each and every single one of us. You watching this video right now, me making this video right now, and every single person that you know. Two of the most popular thinkers in this regard are Karl Marx and the Unabomber. Now, despite agreeing that modern life is, kind of a dystopian nightmare, they actually disagree on quite a bit. So in this episode, we're going to compare and contrast their philosophies on work, labor, society, what's wrong with society, and hopefully we walk away with a better understanding of both. Hello there, my friend. Welcome back to History for Thinkers, a show that brings history to life. So, if you are a longtime viewer of the channel, you'll know that we've covered Karl Marx and the Unabomber in quite a bit of detail. But I know that some people will be new, so if you don't have any background, you don't know anything about either of these guys, I do recommend having a little bit of background knowledge. You can find a lot of videos on the channel where we talk about these guys in a little bit more detail on their own. But listen, I'm not here to tell you how to live your life. If that's not your thing and you want to just dive right into this episode, by all means, be my guest, right? Whatever floats your boat, man. And before we get into the meat and potatoes of the episode, I will say that the Unabomber is much less of an original thinker. The only reason we read his work is because he was a domestic terrorist. If he did not mail these bombs to strangers, we wouldn't be reading this stuff. We wouldn't know about, anything that he did or his thoughts because they were just not that groundbreaking. Doing research for this video, I was spending quite a bit of time reading some, analysis on the Unabomber in, different forums online. And there was one comment, I think, that put it really well. And they said something to the effect of, this would have been a good A+ paper for an undergrad philosophy course. But it's, that's where it begins and ends, right? This would have been like a good undergrad philosophy paper. It's not a groundbreaking treatise. This is not groundbreaking revelations or changing philosophical thought in any meaningful way. It's not least because many of the ideas are not very well thought out and they're not original, right? Even though the Unabomber thinks they are. Let's begin with this. What is wrong with the world? Both of these guys think modern civilization is broken and it's making everyone sad. We're not having our psychological needs met, people are miserable, and they don't quite know why or how they got this way. And these guys kind of put themselves forward to explain why this is, right? What exactly is wrong with the world? Why is everyone miserable? The Unabomber argues that things went wrong with the Industrial Revolution that has disrupted something he calls the power process. Now, we will talk more about the power process a little bit later on because he does give us a definition, but basically it's the ability for you to set goals and work toward those goals, right? In a nutshell. And then there's Marx, and Marx is a little different. So he argues that capitalism is alienating the working class. This is essentially what's wrong with the world today. I will admit this is a bit of an oversimplification of Marx, right? Let's point out that Marx argued that class conflict has always been part of human civilization, right? But for the sake of this video, we'll just leave it at this, right? Capitalism alienates the working class. Now, what's interesting is that both of these things, they begin happening right around the same time, historically speaking, right? The Industrial Revolution and capitalism, right? Like, essentially they go hand in hand, right? It's cookies and milk, as far as human development goes. And I think that explains why there is a little bit of crossover between these two thinkers. So let's get a little bit more detail here. So the Unabomber thinks the Industrial Revolution is creating technology that is depriving us of the power process, right? It's our ability to set meaningful goals, to, basically put forward effort to achieve those goals, and then to actually achieve it, right? So you set the goal, you do it, and then you achieve it, right? But more or less in a nutshell. He does mention this fourth point that he mentions later on in his manifesto that he calls autonomy. And I would, it's really just your ability to do the goal the way you want, right? You have complete autonomy in the process of setting the goal, putting the effort forward, and achieving the goal. But it's, he doesn't really include it in his formal definition. So basically, the Unabomber thinks that we have basically domesticated ourselves, right? He talks about how easy it is to live in modern life, right? If you are just able to follow very simple, basic instructions at your day job, right? Whether you're in an office, whether you're like moving stuff around, that's basically the only qualifier for life. You don't really have to try that hard. It's really easy to live. And he thinks that is what's wrong, right? It is too easy. Right, we've got life on easy mode, and that is depriving us on a psychological level of our need to put forward effort and really try and put our best foot forward. So the Unabomber thinks that society has basically valued technological advancement over individual autonomy. Right, basically every step of the way. What do? Right? We prioritize the system's needs above the individual's needs, right? You got to think about, things like therapy and, modern prescription psych meds, right? Oh, your kid can't pay attention in class. Here, we're going to alter his brain chemistry so he can pay attention, right? The Unabomber would argue that this is something that is unnatural, right? It's not because the kid has a chemical imbalance in their brain. It's because we're not supposed to sit down for like 8 hours a day reading, listening to a teacher ramble on about crap that we don't care about. That is where the Unabomber is really coming from. We don't reform the system, we reform the individual. And that's a big part of his, basically his philosophy. Now, what's interesting to note is that, he goes to extreme lengths to live out in the middle of nowhere. He gets this rural cabin and, he just spends his whole life out there alone, right? Like years and years. And the thing that eventually inspires him to become a terrorist is people building things and, like developing roads and whatnot near his cabin. And that really makes him mad. That's the thing that he's like, all right, I can't escape from this horrible system. I can't live within it, so I'm going to do everything I can to destroy it. So one interesting connection I thought worth mentioning was the basic idea of the power process kind of lines up with the German psychologist Karl Marx's idea about babies, right? And he observed that babies are happy when they realize that they can influence the world, right? So, you have a baby, they don't really know what's going on, but slowly but surely they realize that they can take an action and predictably have a result on the world around them. They can move their arm and pick something up and, put it somewhere else, right? They can crawl somewhere and, they can meaningfully change the world. And Karl Marx argues that this is, something that is really happy for babies to experience. And, even to an extent, as people grow into adulthood, they like being able to change the world around them, right? I think another interesting thing to mention is that the power process kind of lines up with flow state, right? We talk more about that in the Unabomber video. We won't go into too much detail there, but basically your ability to get in the zone and really focus on one specific task and really go all in, right? You think about someone that is like a master of the craft, right? You got to think about like LeBron James playing basketball. That man hits flow state when he is playing basketball. He's killing it. He's, having a blast. And flow state has been proven by psychology to be something that is very pleasurable to do, right? People will do it even if they're not getting paid to do it, right? And they'll do it like crazy, right? You got to think about the people that, they take their hobbies to the extreme. The reason they do it is because they get psychological, they get the feel-good brain chemicals, right? And I think that's really what the Unabomber was trying to get at when he talked about the power process. So Karl Marx and his idea that babies are happy when they realize that they can influence the world, psychologists eventually build on this idea and they say that, all right, if you're happy when you actually do something, then you're unhappy when you can't do something, right? If you have essentially the ability to change the world around you, but you are denied the opportunity, right? Psychologists have called it the trauma of failed influence, right? When you have the ability to move something or change something in some way that would make the world better for you, but you were denied the opportunity. A lot of people have theorized that this is the basis for mental illness, right? You got to think about what would psychologically happen to someone if you locked them inside of a box by themselves for like 10 hours a day. That would be really miserable. On a physiological level, they would just be like ready to die, right? Just sitting. You think about like solitary confinement. It is torture. Solitary confinement is torture, right? At least according to international law. And, on some weird level, this is essentially what we have done to everyone, right? The Unabomber argues that our modern day jobs are basically the physiological equivalent of solitary confinement. You can't really do anything. You can't hit flow state. You can't influence the world around you. And this is causing lots and lots of misery, right? Psychologists would call it the trauma of failed influence, right? We are basically making ourselves mentally ill because we just deny ourselves the opportunity to do anything. We've domesticated ourselves. And let's also acknowledge that it was during the Industrial Revolution that it became normal to spend the vast majority of your life working, right? Where you go to a job and you sell hours of your life in return for money to survive, right? You spend all day at work so you can buy groceries and feed yourself and your kids. And this is the normal arrangement now. And let's be fair and acknowledge that there is some element of truth to this, right? It is right around the Industrial Revolution that this becomes a normal thing. And I would argue that this directly lines up with Marx's theory of alienation, right? And essentially, Marx argues that we are alienated from our labor because, we don't want to do it. We just have to, right? You don't go to your factory job and put, bumpers on cars all day because you want to. You do it so you don't starve and die in the streets, right? Essentially. And there is pretty interesting overlap here because, essentially what they're both saying is that not only is modern life unfulfilling and miserable because of the system, but it's because it is directly tied to your ability to work the way that you want. So in a way, they're kind of saying the same thing, right? We want to spend our lives doing labor and working toward goals that actually matter, not whatever bullshit we're doing at our day jobs. Now, I think it's worth exploring Marx's theory of alienation a little bit here, simply because I'm sure most people are not too familiar with it. I know there's about 4 seasoned Marxists who will know what it is, but for everyone else, let's break it down. The most important part of Marx's philosophy is that he believes that you are what you do. And working, right, directing your labor is a direct manifestation of who and what you are. And this is the way Marx would articulate it. By making things for other people, you are turning some part of your soul into something that's objective, something that is real, something that actually exists in the material world. And when other people enjoy it, that creates psychological wellness for you. So you got to think about something that you've put a lot of effort and time into, and then other people loved, right? I'm not going to lie to you, when I put a lot of effort into these videos, and then people comment and they're like, oh, dude, you changed my perspective. Oh, hey, this really I learned something new, right? That is very meaningful to me in a way that I can't quite articulate. And I think it goes back to Marx's point here, that when you work on something and you put effort into it, you are essentially manifesting some part of your soul, some part of who you are, and you are stamping it on something that is objective and real and something that actually exists. You are expressing yourself. And when other people, use it or enjoy it, that's the ultimate satisfaction. Unfortunately, Marx is a man of many words, and I do think it's worth quoting him at length here. So this is essentially what he says about his theory of alienation. Quote, "Let us suppose that we had carried out production as human beings. Each of us would have, in 2 ways, affirmed himself and the other person. In my production, I would have objectified my individuality, its specific character, and therefore enjoyed not only an individual manifestation of my life during the activity, but also, when looking at the object, I would have the individual pleasure of knowing my personality to be objective, visible to the senses, and hence, a power beyond all doubt. In your enjoyment or use of my product, I would have the direct enjoyment both of being conscious of having satisfied a human need by my work, that is, of having objectified man's essential nature, and of having thus created an object corresponding to the need of another man's essential nature. Our products would be so many mirrors in which we saw reflected our essential nature. That is a really well put quote. It's very long, but I do think it was worth including here. And basically what Marx is saying is that when you do things for other people, not only are you doing things that like it makes you happy and fulfilled to be doing them, but it makes other people happy because it's like, oh hey, like thanks, you just like gave me something, right? You did something that actually provides value to me in some way, right? And Marx's big criticism of capitalism is that we don't do things for the sake of doing them anymore. We do them for a wage, right? We do them because if we don't get paid. And if we don't get paid, we starve and die in the streets. And oddly enough, this has kind of been confirmed by numerous scientific and psychological studies. So let's actually explore some of them. Over-justification is a very popular idea in psychology. It's basically confirmed and accepted by the entirety of the scientific and psychological community. And it was developed by American psychologist Edward Deci. He is a very well-renowned academic. He's basically a thought leader even to this day. And back in the 1970s, him and a few colleagues, basically put on an experiment, a study, right? And what they wanted to do was see if people were equally motivated to do something, whether or not they got a reward, right? And what they found was actually kind of shocking, right? So in their study, they found participants who were paid to complete a task spent less time on it than those who were not paid. And the people who were not paid reported higher levels of enjoyment and interest in the task. This is kind of counterintuitive, right? It doesn't make a lot of sense. You would not assume this to be the case, but it is. So I ask you to help me figure out this thing with my computer because I'm having tech trouble. If I offer to pay you to do it, you're going to do a worse job and you're not going to be as helpful. But if I don't pay you to do it, you're going to enjoy it more, you're going to put forward more effort. And that's just a very weird thing to think about, right? I mean, it's just very strange. It's very counterintuitive. It doesn't make sense. And this is part of the reason that this has been such a big, groundbreaking theory, right? It kind of put the entirety of what we know about psychology on its head. So shout out to Edward Deci for pushing psychology forward in a way. Now, many studies have been done, right? This was initially developed back in the 70s and 80s, but pretty much all the this has been peer reviewed quite a few times, even to this very day, and all the evidence is like, oh yeah, this is true, this is real life. So that's very interesting and really sheds a lot of light. And essentially it confirms that external rewards lower motivation. So now that we understand over-justification, let's acknowledge that this is exactly what Marx was talking about. And the fact that he's writing back in the 1800s, an observation he made hundreds of years ago, turns out to be true, right? And again, this study is only, this is only put forward as a theory in the 1970s. And, today is accepted as scientific fact. So Marx had an extraordinary insight here, right? This is something that, he had no scientific evidence, he had no research, he had no data, he had no way to confirm this. He just came up with something, basically threw a dart at the wall and hit the bullseye. And that is extraordinary. I can't get over that. I think it kind of speaks volumes to how insightful Marx is as an original thinker. So even if we can disagree about, other things that Marx talks about, because let's be real, there's a lot and not everyone agrees with all of it. His theory of alienation is essentially confirmed by science. And then he basically takes this criticism and directs it really at capitalism, because capitalism is the idea that, people are only motivated by their own ruthless self-interest, right? That you would never do anything for other people if you weren't being compensated in some way, right? Typically we think about money, right? You wouldn't go to your job and do your job if you weren't getting a paycheck, right? Like, let's just be real. And to an extent, there is some truth to that. But it doesn't explain away everything, right? Capitalism, there are a lot of things that capitalism cannot account for because, there are some things that money is not the universal incentive that we think it is. And it just goes back to over justification. If you need to have an external reward to do something, it's probably not something you naturally want to do. And let's just think through some examples. Raising kids. It's really difficult and time consuming and expensive to raise kids, but no one has to pay you to do it. You just do it because you have a biological imperative. It's just what you're going to do, right? Think about returning favors to your friends, right? If one of your buddies asks you to help them build a shed in their backyard, you're not going to expect them to pay you $100 an hour or whatever. You're just going to show up and all right, bud, let's knock it out. Let's make it happen. So there are countless examples throughout history and even modern society, right? You think about volunteer firefighters, people that do open source code, Wikipedia editors, right? All these people just selflessly put forward their effort and energy with no external reward, right? The reward is internal. So let's talk a little bit more about Marx's theory of alienation because he expands on this with a lot of detail, right? There is a lot to this. So to him, there are 4 types of alienation. So the first one is you are alienated from the product of your labor, right? Basically, you don't own what you create, right? You show up to your factory, you put one little part on the car, and you get your money, and then you go home. Right, that's basically it. You don't own that bumper. You don't own that car. Everything is owned by your boss, right? One thing Marx talks about quite extensively is how in medieval times, you were an expert craftsman, right? You saw something through from the beginning to the end. There was no assembly line. So if you were an expert craftsman, let's say you work on clocks, right? You would start the clock, you would, tweak it, you would use your, own individual know-how, and then you would end up with a product that you own. And that is something that creates psychological fulfillment, right? Whereas in capitalism, that's not the case, right? We show up to a factory and we all contribute to something because the only way that this product is going to happen is with 1,000 different people specializing in one very specific thing, right? And you think about just about any job today, right? Nobody that works a job owns what they make, right? You're just showing up and selling an hour of your life as if, an hour of your life were a product. Now, the next one is the act of production, right? Essentially, this is how you work. So you think about people. Everyone has their own individual preferences, right? Some people might work at a specific time in a specific way, but you don't really have control over that if you are selling hours of your life to an employer because they're going to tell you how and when and where to work, right? If you really are more productive working remotely and you like to be at home and do your job there, if your boss tells you that you got to come into the office, you're going to have to go into the office. You don't have any leverage in that position, right? The best thing that you can hope for is to quit and find a new job. But that's an extraordinary hurdle. I think another example that everyone will be familiar with is, you're working at a job and you find a way to do something more efficiently, right? What's going to happen is most of the time you're going to oh, hey, you tell your boss, look, I found a way that we can do the same amount of work, but way faster, way easier, and way better. Your boss is probably going to shoot it down because it's oh, hey, listen, this is how we do things. This is how we've always done things. this is how we're always gonna do things. So even though that there's a better way to do it, you're not gonna even necessarily be doing it that way. My wife is actually a nurse, and she worked at a place that demanded that they do all the paperwork by hand. And it's like the 21st century, like everything can and should be on a computer because it's way faster, it's way easier, and it's just all around more efficient. But no, we're going to waste like a third of our day doing paperwork manually by hand because, for some reason the boss just wants it that way, right? It's very goofy, it's very stupid. And yeah, we got to move on though. I spent too much time riffing on that one. So another thing Marx says that we are alienated from is other workers, right? So under capitalism, essentially what is going on is everyone is, selling hours of their life as a worker. And what ends up happening is us as workers, we are not necessarily together, right? Marx's thing is he's trying to unite the workers because under capitalism, essentially workers are all competing with each other, right? Who can do the most work for the least amount of money? Who can make the capitalist the most happy, right? Who is going to be, the biggest suck up? Who's going to, do overtime that's unpaid, right? To win favor with the business owner because that person is ultimately going to win out, right? The boss wants people that will do more work for less money. And that's just kind of a fundamental truth, right? And let's also acknowledge from the business owner's perspective, they are logically incentivized to do that, right? It doesn't make the business owner bad for wanting people who work hard for the same amount of pay. That's just logically what they should want. And it's interesting. I've actually got another anecdote on this one. I had worked at a remote job a very long time ago, and it was very boring and miserable. So eventually what I started doing was I found ways to automate it, right? I would code ways that, make my job basically obsolete. And I was like, oh, hey, cool, I can run this code and I don't have to sit at the computer all day. It's like I can do an entire day's worth of work in 5 minutes because I found code that can automate it, right? Awesome, sweet. Now I get a paycheck and I get free time. That was kind of great. Well, what I eventually ended up doing was telling a coworker about it. And what did that coworker do? He told my boss. So yeah, things went bad from there because I was not supposed to do that. And it was a big fiasco. It was kind of sad. But it just kind of gets at this point that all workers are in competition with each other, right? Think about if you were to be truly honest with one of your coworkers, right? There's a very real possibility they stab you in the back, all right? Because at the end of the day, we've all reduced ourselves to tools, and we are just competing to be the most used and beloved tool by the boss. And the fourth type of alienation, and probably the most difficult to understand, is the alienation from your own soul. Now, this is translated a little differently depending. The word Marx uses specifically translates to your species essence, which is just kind of weird. I would never actually say that. I just say soul because, basically what he's getting at is functionally the same point. Basically, this is the idea that you would not do your job if your survival didn't depend on it. So it's basically just something that's alien to you. Right? If you won the lottery tomorrow, would you still do your job? For 99% of people, the answer is going to be hell no. Right? I win the lottery tomorrow. I ain't going to work tomorrow. Right? That's just kind of the way it goes for most people. And Marx kind of makes a big point that this being true, this is something that's external to you, something that you are coerced to do. It is similar to if you were a slave. And you're forced to do something, picking cotton was external to the slave, right? It's not something that they were born or naturally inclined to do. They had to do it or they were going to be horribly beaten and abused and so on and so forth. So at this point, let's just acknowledge that they're talking about the same thing, but Marx has a lot more detail. He's clearly thought this through a little bit more. And the Unabomber, despite, having the opportunity and the ability to have read Marx, is clearly just trying to get at the same thing, but doing a much worse job, right? He's basically reinventing the wheel from scratch. And what he comes up with is just a very weird way of talking about the act of production, right? Because you think about the power process, right? It's your ability to set goals, work toward those goals, and then, achieve them, and then have autonomy in the whole process. That is just the act of production, right? How you work and what you work on. And then you got, Marx, he came up with three things that, the Unabomber is like, oh my God, this would have been news to him. This probably would have been a big revelation for the Unabomber, but he never read Marx, right? Which is just kind of sad, because I think that the Unabomber, this probably would have resonated with him, right? Had the Unabomber known about Marx's theory of alienation, he probably would have been like, oh shit, this is why everyone is really miserable. This makes a lot more sense than this, the whole power process thing. Whoa, I had no idea. I think as a side point worth mentioning is that people act like the Unabomber was a genius, and I do not disagree with the fact that he was, he was born with a natural intelligence, right? I mean, his accomplishments in math speak for themselves. But when it comes to this, political stuff and what's wrong with the world and, the types of alienation, I mean, he just kind of falls short, right? He is not as smart as people are making him out to be, right? Again, he would have got an A+ as a philosophy undergrad. None of his ideas were really original, and if we just look at Marx's 4 types of alienation here, he has identified one of them. One. And, he kind of poorly articulated it, because it doesn't make a lot of sense. And this kind of gets us at a truth about thinking. You cannot really come up with great ideas on your own, right? Humans naturally think in dialogue. We need to have a conversation. We need to be exposed to different ideas so we can refine our own worldview. That is the only way, right? I guarantee you that Marx probably didn't completely come up with these on his own. He was probably going back and forth with Friedrich Engels or one of the other people that he was friends and associates with, right? This is just kind of how it goes. If you want to be a great thinker, you need to expose yourself to different ideas and have a conversation with them and think back, and the Unabomber, he's just out in la la land, right? He thinks he's just going to invent the entire wheel from scratch. And he does get, let's acknowledge he does make some valid points, but, he is making the Android version of Marx's iPhone. All right, that's basically what's going on here. So both of these guys have a lot of ideas on what's wrong with the world, why people are miserable, and, they have different reasons for, how people cope with it. So Marx says that a big one, right, a big tool for social control is religion. And he has this famous quote where he says, religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people, right? So basically it's the idea that you focus on a fictional afterlife in order to cope with wasting the entirety of your actual life. And that is pretty sad. The Unabomber argues that the way that we cope with the Industrial Revolution disrupting the power process is by doing surrogate activities, right? So in order to replace the hole left by the power process, we developed surrogate activities that he describes as, quote, an activity that is directed toward an artificial goal that people set up for themselves merely in order to have some goal to work toward. Now it gets tricky. What is the difference between doing the power process the right way and doing a surrogate activity? And this is where we kind of see the flaw in the Unabomber's thinking, right? Because essentially he thinks that if you don't need it, then it's a surrogate activity, right? So if you are, one of the examples he gives is Emperor Hirohito after World War II becoming a marine biologist, right? This is a surrogate activity. He doesn't have to do that. He's just doing it because he needs to make up a goal for him to do, which is kind of a weird way to think about it. And I'm sure everyone has had some really useless goal that they've set up for themselves just to do it, right? I've done it. I used to get really obsessive about running, and at one point in time, my mile time was all the way down to 6 minutes and 28 seconds. I didn't really run competitively. I didn't really need to. Like, I didn't have some physical I needed to pass. Like, I was just doing it, like, for the sake of doing it, right? It's kind of arbitrary. I could have spent all that time and energy and effort into something more productive that, I actually would have gotten some kind of return, but instead I was just, running at a park, right? It's kind of weird, right? Now, to show you kind of the flaw with thinking of things as either, being part of the power process or a surrogate activity, let's think about this example, right? So I want you to imagine a world famous popular comedian, right? Can be any comedian that it doesn't really matter who, but the Unabomber would argue that this comedian is, doing comedy as a surrogate activity. It's not something that is necessarily providing for his basic needs, right? He's not hunting, he's not finding love, right? This is just a surrogate activity. He's doing it for the sheer sake of doing it. It's pointless, right? Now, what's weird is that I'm pretty sure that we can all agree that this comedian theoretically would be happy, right? If you are telling jokes to the world, making people laugh, and kind of shedding your own little truth out there in your own way, that is a really enjoyable thing to be doing, right? It doesn't matter if it's directly providing for your basic needs or not, right? Like, that's just kind of a weird way to think about it. And, think back to, the over-justification, right? If the comedian is doing it because he has a genuine intrinsic passion to do it, and he does it regardless of whether or not he makes money from it or has some kind of external reward, he should enjoy doing it, just for the sake of doing it, right? I know a lot of people who are, kind of naturally just those comedy people. They always go out of their way to have the most hyperbolic, crazy take on things just to get a rise out of people. And I think another big part of with the Unabomber is that there is no possible scenario in his mind that you can be happy with technology. In order for you to be happy, in order for you to hit the power process the way that he wants you to, you need to not have any technology at all. If you have a car, you've got surrogate activities. If you have, a house that someone else built, surrogate activity, right? It's just very goofy. It's just a very flawed way of thinking about the world. All right, so now that we understand, basically the gist of what these guys are saying, let's look at how they apply their philosophy to their own lives, right? Because that'll be a really telling point of whether or not, their ideas have merit. So the Unabomber he was living his own theoretical dream, right? But he still spent most of his time sending bombs to strangers. So it just kind of, according to the Unabomber, oh yeah, this is the utopian lifestyle that everyone should be living. Out in the middle of the woods, completely alone, on your, you set your own goals and do your own thing, and that's the entirety of your life. That wasn't enough even for him, right? Let's put aside whether or not anyone else would actually want to live that way. Not even he did, right? He still spent his time. Would mailing the bombs be considered a surrogate activity, right? It didn't provide for his needs. So mailing the bombs wasn't part of the power process, Ted. Come on. But then you compare this to Marx, and it's a little different, right? So Marx lived off the financial support of his friend Friedrich Engels, right? And it was never very much money. Engels was able to basically just provide Marx with subsistence living, just enough to survive, really. But what that allowed Marx to do was spend most of his life writing, right? Even if he had to live in poverty, he was able to provide for his family. He was able to pay the bills and get food and, have a roof over his head. So he could do the thing that to him was the most important thing, right? Working and writing and thinking, and he controlled how he did those things. So if you can say nothing, even if you reject Marx's theory about work and labor and his theory of alienation, you can at least concede that Marx actually believed it. If nothing else, Marx actually believed the shit that he wrote. Whereas, you look at the Unabomber, his own life is a contradiction, right? I mean, mailing bombs was a surrogate activity, even though he's supposedly living in his own version of utopia. So it just kind of completely falls apart. And I think it just goes to show Marx has a much better understanding of what is wrong with the world than the Unabomber does. So this is the part of the episode where we need to talk about something that the Unabomber railed against quite a bit in his manifesto, something that he calls the left, right? So this is a group that he strongly opposes, but he doesn't really give a good definition for it, right? In fact, in his own manifesto, he just kind of vaguely lists some of these different groups that are part of the left, but he's like, yeah, not everyone in these groups are leftists. Like, it doesn't really make sense, right? Essentially, for all intents and purposes, to the Unabomber, the left is just an all-encompassing word for bad, right? It doesn't really mean anything, right? If you're a socialist, a collectivist, an animal rights activist, if you are pro-disability, right? Like you want to build wheelchair ramps for people, right? You're a leftist. If you're gay, you're a member of the LGBT community, you're a leftist. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. Now, the part that I absolutely have to tell you about is that Ted Kaczynski, when he was, going through his life, before he became a complete recluse, dropped off the face of the earth, he almost had transgender surgery. In fact, I think he actually mentions it in the manifesto. So there is almost certainly some kind of Freudian psychoanalysis that could be going on here, right? He hates the left because, well, those monsters almost got me convinced that I was a woman. Right? There's something weird going on about that, and how it connects to his idea about the left and whatever the heck that is. But we're not going to spend too much time psychoanalyzing the Unabomber's sexual kinks and how they influence his political philosophy. We'll do that another time. So again, the left is just this all-encompassing group of many divergent and different people with different goals. And according to the Unabomber, they all hate themselves and have feelings of inferiority, and they are this way because they are over-socialized, right? You see, the problem with you leftists is that you're so busy spending time with your friends and family, you didn't realize that you were over-socialized. What you really should have been doing is spending all your time alone in the woods so you could have been happy like me. Like, essentially, that's what the Unabomber is saying in his manifesto, and it's really weird. It's definitely the weirdest part of the manifesto. And then at one point in the Unabomber's manifesto, he goes on this really weird tirade. He claims that leftist thinkers, they deny science, evidence, and reality. And of course, like the kind of people that tend to do this, he doesn't name any of them, right? These leftist thinkers deny science. And, of course, he doesn't name anyone that denies science, because guess what? Then we would be able to have an actual discussion. When you're just like painting a picture of like a broad, vague boogeyman, it's like really easy to like talk shit about that boogeyman, because guess what? Like, it doesn't really represent anyone. It's almost kind of amusing, but kind of scary and sad at the same time, because you can very clearly tell when reading the Unabomber's manifesto that he has a deep hatred of all these people, right? If you're gay, if you're in a wheelchair, if you're a socialist, right? Any of those kinds of, anyone in any of these groups, they are just evil and horrible and just the worst, right? They're everything that's wrong with the world, and they're advancing science and technology to enslave everyone and ruin everything. Listen, Ted, I want you to show me on the doll where they hurt you. What did they do to you? Show me on the doll. It's okay. Ted, it's gonna be okay, man. It's actually really ironic, because one of his criticisms of industrial society is that it's destroying the environment, right? Which something he specifically lists as a leftist cause. And there is, in fact, science and evidence showing like, oh, hey, by everyone driving a car all the time, there are all these horrible consequences for the environment. and, we're polluting things, right? You can't breathe in the air. There's all kinds of chemicals in the rain, right? All these horrible things. Do you know who is not denying the science and the evidence and the reality there, Ted? I'm going to give you a hint. It's not the leftists. In fact, the people who are denying the science and evidence are otherwise decent people who have been duped by the corporate fossil fuel propaganda to think that, pollution is like a good thing, or, whatever the hell those people think. So I think at this point of the video, it's important to point out that the Unabomber is a deeply troubled man. He's very clearly mentally ill. He's got all kinds of horrible things going on, like huge leaps in logic. I mean, if you just read the manifesto, it's like, oh, this is someone that is not well, right? Even if you ignore the parts about like mailing bombs to strangers, right? Even if you ignore that part, it's like, oh, this is someone that's not well. And you almost have to wonder, is it because he was the victim of one of the MK Ultra experiments, right? So if you know anything about Ted Kaczynski outside of this video, you probably know that he was a victim of this, right? And it's very sad because he was this brilliant, young, accomplished, award-winning mathematician, right? True or false? There are still awards that he won hanging at the wall at UC Berkeley to this day, right? I haven't confirmed it. I've heard it online, but I don't care enough to fact check it. It might be true. But the point is that he was a very well accomplished thinker and intellectual, someone that just had a brilliant gift for math. And and then MK Ultra happens, and then well, we know the rest of the story, right? It's very sad. And then when you think about what was going on with MK Ultra, right? What even was MK Ultra, right? This was a government program by the CIA to figure out how to brainwash people, right? This was going on, I think it was in like the 70s. So this really was the goal to brainwash people to love capitalism and to hate socialism, right? You got to think this is at the peak of the Cold War. Everyone's worried about the communist invasion. And, essentially what the goal was is that we're going to win people over any way that we can. So if people are like naturally becoming sympathetic to socialism and joining forces with the Soviet Union, well, we got to develop a brainwashing program to like stop that from happening, right? One thing I think is worth mentioning is just how scary it is to think maybe the MK Ultra brainwashing experiment actually worked. I mean, here we've got Ted, who was an otherwise smart, happy, well-adjusted, successful mathematician, and he gets brainwashed by the CIA, and he hates the left. He thinks everyone that is gay or wants wheelchair ramps at their local library is like, undermining civilization somehow. It really is kind of scary, because I see a lot of people use the left as this all-encompassing boogeyman word that literally means nothing, right? So maybe the CIA with the MK Ultra came up with this tactic, way back when. They perfected it on Ted, right? Who knows? At what point do we say like, oh God, how horribly did the CIA mess this guy up, right? Because again, he was a successful, brilliant mathematician. He was going places. He was going to change the world in math. And, he kind of had his whole future stolen from him because the CIA wanted to test out, their little experiments to see if they can control people's brains. All right, so now that we've established basically their philosophies, where they differ, where they diverge, and where the Unabomber gets a little goofy, let's be real, let's talk about another serious philosophical difference between them. The difference between collectivism versus individualism, right? This is a very hot topic, very big debate even to this day, and it has been for a very long time. And they do very much operate on, complete opposite ends of the spectrum, right? Marx is maximal collectivist and the Unabomber is maximal individualist, right? So Marx argued that we needed collectivism essentially to, use technological advancement and collective ownership to prevent human suffering. Again, it goes back to like the alienation of the working class, right? We want people to stop suffering. We need to collectivize things. We need to come together and own these things collectively, because that's the only way we're going to figure this shit out, right? And then there's the Unabomber, and essentially he's saying that we need, even though we already have a pretty individualistic society, we need to double down on it and take it even further, right? If you live with other people, you're a collectivist, right? You should be living like me, out in the woods in the middle of nowhere, mailing bombs to strangers. This is the way back, right? This is the golden path, right? The path to happiness. So Marx wants to see a more collective society, and the Unabomber wants to see a more individualistic society, right? If maybe even a hyper-individualistic society. But let's talk about how they differ on how we get there, right? So Marx argued that what we need to do is transition from a capitalist society to a socialist one where workers own the means of production, right? The only way that we're going to fix this shit is if we have workers, people who actually work in the factory, have control and say over what goes on in the factory, right? Even if we can disagree on whether or not that's a good thing, it actually does logically follow, right? If nothing else, you can admit that Marx is at least being logically consistent here. And then there's the Unabomber. And essentially his answer is that we need to return to our roots by killing everyone that uses technology and living in the woods in complete isolation. I hope it goes without saying that this, even if we can accept the individualism, even if we can accept the anti-technology approach, I don't think anyone is going to be on board for this, Ted. This is just not the solution. This is not the answer that we need. And it's evidenced by the impact that they each had, right? So if we look at Karl Marx, he has influenced hundreds of millions of people all around the world. There have been countless countries and different societies that have done their own little socialist experiments, right, with varying degrees of success. We can all agree that there were a lot of problems with places like the Soviet Union, but you look at, like modern day China, even, to an extent Cuba, and some of these places actually do have redeeming qualities, right? You look at what's actually happening on the ground, and oh, hey, maybe there are elements of this that are not so horrible, right? And then you look at the impact that the Unabomber has, and guess what? No one has joined the Freedom Club, Ted. No one has, joined in this anti-technology revolution and mailed bombs to strangers to, kill computer science professors. No one's doing it. Which is really weird because, the Unabomber really thought that, his little fiasco was going to kick off like an international frenzy. His manifesto is going to get published and everyone's going to join in and do this too. No one has. Like, not one. Like, he's the only guy that's done it. Which is, yeah, it's really kind of sad. In some ways, I almost can't help but feel bad for the Unabomber because, oh, damn, bro, you were so disconnected from the world. Maybe you should not have been out there in the woods by yourself. Someone could have fact-checked you on this, bro. And finally, we can kind of talk about the reality of the situation, right? What's really going on with these different thinkers and their ideas, right? So if you look at Marx, he had some valid points. There are some elements of what Marx said, if only because he wrote so much, right? Let's not forget, you look at Das Kapital. I mean, it is like multi-volume. There's thousands of words. I mean, he makes so many claims that it's hard not to get some of it right. I mean, if you can at least concede that. But there are things that they are an accurate representation of reality, right? One of the most interesting things about getting into, biology and animals and animal behavior is how much it can teach us actually about human behavior, right? You look at chimpanzees and evolution, and there is a lot of crossover to their behavior and ours, right? Humans, we used to live in small nomadic tribes, and that's how chimpanzees live in nature, right? There's a lot of similarity there. In fact, Marx actually goes on to argue that humans before industrial society, or not even industrial, humans before agricultural society, essentially lived in something that he called primitive communism, right? And essentially, it is this idea that we had no property, there was no hierarchy, there was none of that. That's a little bit of an oversimplification. But if you read Francis Fukuyama and the Origins of Political Order, it actually goes to show that there are a lot of points that Marx made about, pre-agricultural society that actually are kind of true, right? It goes even farther back than Marx, right? Because Marx was just kind of piggybacking off of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And, even Fukuyama admits that there are a lot of points that Rousseau made about primitive humans and human nature that are true. Agricultural society comes and, maybe that's the revolution that Ted should have had a problem with, not the Industrial Revolution, but the Agricultural Revolution, because that's really when things went horribly, horribly wrong. But we'll talk more about this in a future video, I promise. Another point that's really worth mentioning on the collectivism versus individualism debate is that humans are social creatures, right? And it's in our nature, right? If you take a newborn baby and you just put it out into the wild, it is going to die. It is never going to figure out how to eat, how to drink, how to move. It's just not going to get that far, right? We need, I think psychologists call it cultural learning, right? It is essentially where you, as, like a child or a baby, you can kind of mimic the behavior of someone else and you can build upon it. And, just kind of figure it out just by seeing someone else do it, right? If you've ever learned how to do something that way, like I'm sure you have, right? This is how you learn to walk. This is how you learn to speak, right? We're not giving babies like a manual on how to like move your lips and figure out how to talk. Like you just kind of talk to a baby and sooner or later it's going to talk back, right? It's pretty fascinating, right? It is pretty remarkable. And it, just goes to show humans don't exist on their own. We are social creatures. We evolved to live in tribes, and we did not evolve to live in random huts in complete isolation in the woods. Sorry, Ted. It's just not how we lived. And I think another point worth acknowledging is that even the Unabomber's hyper-individualistic approach is inherently flawed. Right? One thing he doesn't mention in his Unabomber manifesto is the fact that his own parents helped him live this little fantasy of his. If it hadn't been for his parents helping him buy the land and helping him, get food and supplies from time to time, he wouldn't have been able to survive out in the woods for as long as he did. He probably would have died, right? He probably would have killed himself out there. But because he had family, he had, a tribe to take care of him and kind of, fix things when they're going wrong. It's kind of, again, it's just kind of a big argument against his entire worldview. All right, so let's talk about some of the takeaways here. So the Unabomber, or Kaczynski, was a brilliant original thinker, right? A very talented, gifted mathematician who really could have changed the world. I have no doubt that he would have done something great with his life had the CIA not ruined everything. Who knows? He could have been like a modern day Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Like he could have been like that next leap in philosophical thought and progress. But, again, the CIA just ruins everything. He just lived his whole life in complete isolation. Even though we can acknowledge he was really smart when it came to math, right? He was a talented, distinguished mathematician at a very early age. His political ideas, like the power process, surrogate activities, this is not very good philosophy, right? Again, it goes back to that internet comment. This is an A+ on an essay in an undergrad class. This is not groundbreaking. None of his thoughts are really original ideas. They just seem original to him because he's never heard anyone make them before. That's why he is so convinced that he's found the answer. He's just never read Marx's theory of alienation, so he just doesn't know it exists. He doesn't know someone has already described everything wrong with work and labor and yada, yada, yada. Karl Marx may or may not have been smarter than the Unabomber, right? Probably not, let's be real. But his writings are much more thought out. Right? They're much more developed. There is a lot more effort and conscious thought put into them simply because of the fact that he was collaborating with others. Right? Him and Engels, sometimes it's hard to say who wrote what, right? Was it Marx or Engels? Right? Because, they just go back and forth so much. Having even one other person to bounce ideas off of and develop them and think about them and have conversations about them, that is just the way forward. That is the way that you really develop and refine these ideas. It's not in complete isolation, right? Which is really, I would argue, why Ted's manifesto was not the banger that he thought it was. It could have been something great had he spent more time developing these ideas and, with a peer of people who were more familiar with this stuff and, and reading more and thinking more about it. Again, it's just very sad. I can't help but see the wasted potential that is Ted Kaczynski. And as a final point that I find almost kind of funny, but kind of scary as well, is this troubling connection between the Unabomber's anti-left narrative and the CIA's MKUltra brainwashing experiment. Because the Unabomber, he is not the first person to use the left as this all-encompassing evil boogeyman and then kind of rail against it and how they deny science and reality. And of course, he can't name any. He never name any. But it's just so weird because I see this a lot. I see a lot of people do this. I fall into this trap. And I can't help but think that they came up with it at the CIA MKUltra brainwashing experiment, right? This somehow goes back to the CIA. I don't know how to prove it. One day, it probably can't be proved because most of the documents from the MKUltra experiments were destroyed, probably to cover up some horrible, heinous crimes. But that's a side point. Anyway, I really hope you enjoyed the episode. I really hope you enjoyed this new approach. It feels really good to upload again. I really missed being active on the channel, and I'm going to make an effort to start uploading weekly videos now, so you can at least, hopefully, expect a new video at least once a week from me. So, thank you so much for tuning in and listening all the way through. I really hope you enjoyed the episode, and, this doesn't have to be a one-way conversation. Leave a comment. Right? Like maybe there's some other aspect to the Unabomber that you think is really brilliant that I didn't bring up, right? Feel free to call me out, right? Feel free to oh, hey, you didn't talk about this. What about this? What about that, right? You were wrong about that. I am open to it. Let's have a conversation. Let's continue. Because that's how we refine our ideas. That's how we become better thinkers. It's not in a vacuum. It's by working and thinking together. Thank you so much. I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.